Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is Forbes producer, Forbes reporter, Forbes host of Eye on Iowa, Sarah Muller. Sarah, for the last time ever for an Eye on Iowa, thank you so much for joining me.
Yes, of course. And I apologize for my voice. I had a long weekend, if you didn't notice.
What were you doing? No, just kidding. Of
Oh,
course you
nothing big.
nothing big, just being Forbes's eyes and ears and boots on the ground all over Iowa. So let's just ask point blank, what the heck happened last night?
Surprise to no one, Donald Trump came out on top. They called the race within 30 minutes, which is probably the earliest in recent history, if not ever. And then obviously we had kind of the duel between Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis, and Ron DeSantis just barely made it into second place above Nikki Haley by about 2 points. So it was a very tight race, and then the big kind of ender of the night was that Vivek Ramaswamy has suspended his campaign and has dropped out and endorsed Donald Trump, and so here we are now seeing, who are the contenders and who are the pretenders and who can make it through the next couple of weeks here.
The race has definitely been whittled down to three. And I remember I was at the Iowa caucuses back in 2020, and I remember being on the plane and we didn't even know who the winner was at that time. Yes, there was a technical glitch, but you and I were texting last night, and at before 8 p.m., I don't know the exact time, but before 8 p.m., it was called for Donald Trump. So can you describe just how historic that is?
Yeah, I mean, granted, what happened in 2020, because I was working in a newsroom then too, it was the Democrats, and they were running a new system, and we all stayed up till 4 o'clock in the morning trying to figure out what was going on. But this is a very different type of process, as I mentioned in one of our last videos. It's interesting because it's a ballot system, right? So they can get answers very quickly depending on how long those speeches go. So at 7 o'clock, they started the caucus process, and by 7:30, some of those results were coming in. And a lot of news outlets were calling it based on the entrance polls and based on previous polling that we saw, and also the start of some of those results. So there was a lot of things that kind of contributed to it, that we knew Donald Trump was going to come out on top. We just didn't necessarily know by how much. We knew it was going to be probably significant, but yeah, it is a pretty big deal. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's been a long time, or if ever, that somebody has won by this margin before.
Donald Trump won almost every county in Iowa. He almost made a full Grassley when it comes to winning those counties, 98 out of 99. Nikki Haley did win one. So he won cities and rural areas alike. What are the takeaways from last night for you?
I think it's not surprising that he took rural Iowa, because that's where he's thrived in the past. It's kind of those cities and some of those more moderate areas. I did find it interesting that Nikki Haley took a couple of those bigger areas. So, yeah, I think it just shows that Donald Trump still has a massive foothold. I was on the ground talking to a lot of voters this weekend just about their kind of overall feel. And even the people who were opposing Trump and, choosing DeSantis or Nikki, they are all standing behind. We don't want Joe Biden. We would rather have a GOP nominee. So if it is Donald Trump at the end of the day, we will vote Donald Trump. So that was kind of interesting that, people are sticking with their party despite, the legal battles or, January 6th events. And so they just want to see a GOP candidate in office again.
So from your conversations with voters, is it fair that GOP voter sentiment in Iowa is anyone but Biden opposed to these never Trumpers?
Yeah, I think what was interesting is over the last year that I've been talking to voters, a lot of times I was running into people who were, I just want to find a candidate other than Trump, right? But now that the field has kind of narrowed down, they're kind of saying, okay, looking at some of our options here, obviously Trump might be the nominee. And so a lot of the events I went to this weekend were, campaign events. And so the pool is a little bit different, but I was surprised by how many people I'd go and talk to on caucus day yesterday. And I'd say, we're at a Vivek event. Are you going to caucus for Vivek? And they said, I don't know, maybe. They still hadn't made up their minds. So, we also listened to some interviews on some of the networks last night, and there were people who were in their seat at the caucus saying, I'm fairly sure I'm going to caucus for this person, but I want to listen to the speeches and I might be swayed. So really, it can come into that last moment.
I gotta say, I really appreciate the open-mindedness that Iowa voters seem to have, and they really respect this process. So now, if you can remember Friday, it does seem so long ago because you've been out and about all weekend, but you said that the winner and loser could be Ron DeSantis. He had the most to win. He also had the most to lose. How did he fare last night? Because he came in second, but a very small second place. The AP had him at 21.1% and Nikki Haley at 19.1%.
Yeah, this is really interesting. And I kept my eyes between them the whole night because it seems like he really needed to have more of a push to get through versus Nikki Haley. If she would have won, one of the experts that you spoke to even said if she even won by just a little bit, it would have been a massive victory for her against Ron DeSantis, where Ron DeSantis needed a little bit more of a margin to kind of prove, he's as solid of a candidate. What's interesting is comparing those numbers again to New Hampshire, where Nikki is polling very well. So I think Ron DeSantis really needs to make some ground game in New Hampshire to be able to compete against Nikki. And we'll have to see how it shakes out. But I think this is going to be kind of a part two we're going to see in a couple of weeks here.
And I do now want to just ask you, who are your winners and losers from the Iowa caucuses? Obviously, Trump just had that huge lead. Winner, who? Anyone else a winner, or is everyone else a second place, essentially loser?
Yeah, it's interesting that you phrase it that way because it felt like we had a lot of small wins and maybe a couple of losses, right? We can talk about Ron DeSantis coming in second place, but only by a short margin. We can talk about Nikki Haley coming in third place, but it was very close. This is kind of like two sides of the same coin. But one of the biggest losers is obviously Vivek Ramaswamy dropping out. I think he thought the results were going to be significantly different than what they were. And I think then he was fully prepared to drop out for when the results came through.
Sarah, I believe I heard on a podcast today that a reporter did say that Ron DeSantis flew from Iowa to South Carolina. So it looks like we're looking at New Hampshire, South Carolina, Super Tuesday to really shake things out. I know this is the last Eye on Iowa segment. So what's next for you on your radar?
So we are kind of readjusting this segment and we're combining forces to look at the road to the White House, which will be our next big project instead of Eye on Iowa. And we will be looking at New Hampshire, South Carolina, and the rest of what's to come, right? So we'll keep our eye out on what's going on with DeSantis, Nikki, obviously Trump. It's going to be an interesting race and how it shakes out because at this point we're talking about cabinet seats. At this point we're talking about administration for Trump and what that would look like, which speaking of, during his speech, he called out Doug Bergam, who gave him a last minute endorsement and said he wants to find a place for him in his administration. So not sure what they would put Doug Bergam in, but it's interesting to see that they are already kind of thinking through, even running mates, right? Who's going to be Trump's running mate in the long term. So we'll be keeping an eye out on all of those things, you, me, and our colleague Kat. And so it'll be a great race to watch over the next few months.
And we were lucky enough to talk to Doug Bergam on this program. Were there any other names floated in Iowa this weekend aside from his? Because I know Vivek, the moment he dropped out, he essentially then went to support Trump.
Yeah, it was interesting that Trump has kept a pretty good relationship with Vivek through this whole thing and then kind of took some jabs at him this weekend on Truth Social. And then at the events I saw with Vivek, he spoke, I'm never going to disrespect Donald Trump and what he did in office. And I know that he's taken some hits at me this weekend, but I'm going to stay true to, I'm not going to get into that kind of slanderous behavior. But yeah, it was interesting listening to Donald Trump's speech last night, I will say, because it was the nicest speech I think we've heard from him in recent history, as opposed to, some of how he's spoken about some of his co-runners in this race. And he spoke nicely of Ron DeSantis. There was some interesting word choices when he was talking about Doug Bergam, and it's the best governor in the United States. And obviously Kim Reynolds has endorsed DeSantis. So there's maybe some little, jabs here and there, but overall, it was a very nice speech in saying that he wanted to bring unity together again. And yeah, so it was definitely a different play than what he normally has spoken about. But yeah, so we'll have a long road ahead to see what happens.
And not to mention, Ron DeSantis is a governor himself, so that seems like that could have been a two-pronged jab. If it in fact was. Sarah, please go get a nap, take a nap, please get some rest. And we've got a lot to cover come primary season. It is continuing to roar on. Thank you so much for your reporting. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Brittany.